Now we've got it. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming in to join us for, gosh, this is our first in-person coffee talk since the start of the pandemic. So it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also some new faces. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Emma Marsden and I am the interpretive curator at the Des Plaines History Center. I get the pleasure of setting up all of our speakers, and we've got a really great talk for you today with Greg Jacobs. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes. We do have some events coming up aside from this. If you want to join us this Saturday, we'll be hosting our annual Pies on the Porch event, where you can buy pies for the slice for a great cause from some great bakeries, including the amazing bakery in downtown Des Plaines, Jewel, and Mariano's. They'll be this Saturday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then our next in-person coffee talk will be next month on September 9th, Tales of Forgotten Chicago with Rich Lindbergh. Today we have Greg Jacobs. He's a personal collector of original photographs from Camp Grant. Everything you can see on the table here, this is all things that he's brought, and he's got quite a collection going. He is a Vietnam veteran who now works in law enforcement, and over 60 years ago, his father was drafted and trained at Camp Grant. And just a quick minor note here, if you notice on the flyer here, you can see that the picture we included for our flyer actually does include some Des Plaines residents who were at Camp Grant. So that is taken from some real photographs from our collection. And finally, please do, if you have a chance, go see Melba over at the Village Bank and Trust table in the front. They are our wonderful sponsors for these programs, and without them, we wouldn't be able to keep doing these. So if you have a chance, go see her. But first, Greg Jacobs.
This lecture is dedicated to my grandfather, George E. Jacobs, Sr., who was there in World War I. My father, George E. Jacobs, Jr., who was sent there when he got his draft notice in World War II. My very good friend who passed away, Terry Dyer. And lastly, Arthur E. Heidecke. He was a band corporal in the headquarters company, 333rd Field Artillery, World War I. He started out at Camp Grant. Right here in Des Plaines. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever been to the Rockford Airport?
Yes.
Quite a few, very good. Well, let your imaginations wander backwards 104 years. No concrete runway, no fuel tanks, no current modern buildings. All open farm fields, like this photograph right here. This is a blow-up of an original snapshot of the time.
And I'll pass this around.
It was all farms owned by the Samuelsons, the McClartys, the James, A.C. Johnson family, Maxwell family, and a few others. The land was obtained by the U.S. government for the creation of an Army cantonment camp. In June of 1917, surveyors were out there marking out the streets and where each building would go. Excuse me. On the 16th of June, 1917, Edward H. Bennett, an architect from Chicago, was asked to submit plans for the camp. The camp was laid out on a 35-foot plateau, and the axis for the barracks was northwest to southeast. They did that so that they would catch breezes coming through because there was no air conditioning. And if you're wearing a wool uniform in the summer, especially or walking out on a day like this, you need air conditioning. On July 1st, the construction began. The Quartermaster Corps Major Sawyer was in charge. There was no name for the camp at that point. It was just called Cantonment Rockford. The Chicago firm of Bates and Rogers had the contract to build the camp. Well, they had 1,100 buildings. 1,400 buildings, excuse me. 25 miles of sewers, 22 miles of water pipe, 6 miles of gas mains, 12 miles of hard roads. As I mentioned, the McClarty farmhouse was destined to be converted into the commanding officer's quarters. They added a wraparound porch and amenities that officers enjoy. The James farmhouse was kept also, and that would be later converted into the press corps headquarters. I'll go into more of that in a little bit. The rest of the farmhouses were all taken down. The barns were taken down with the exception of the big red barn on the A.C. Johnson property. As near as I can guess, if you ever get out that way again and you have the airport to your back and you're looking north, that would, the A.C. Johnson farm would have been about the 2 o'clock position. It's all industrial now. There's nothing really left of the old farm buildings. The first group of selected men, draftees, arrived at the camp on the 5th of September to become part of the National Army. Training ensued. They didn't have uniforms at first, so they were learning how to march in their street clothes. They didn't have weapons, so they made practice rifles out of wood, carved wood. It did look like a rifle, just so they could learn the manual of arms. Then they went through the mill, as they called it. What's now Falcon Road out there by the Rockford Airport was where all the quartermaster stores were. Going through the mill was getting your uniforms. Everybody was issued the tunic, winter and summer overcoat, the stylish sombrero of the U.S. Army, better known as the campaign hat, the Montana peak, and then they went back into classes, marching, learning how to handle the weapons, but they really didn't have a rifle range yet. The 311th Engineers and the 32nd Engineers were out there along the Kishwaukee River, which is now Atwood Park, just south of Rockford. And they carved out the range, the rifle pits on the south side of the river, and the target pits on the north side of the river. The target pit is still with us. If you ever get out to Atwood Park, it's right on the river. And they didn't have a lot of machinery. If you could show the ladies and gentlemen the picture of the gentleman with the machete. That's how they carved out the range, that picture. That's how they carved out the range, get all the brush out of the way. A handheld machete that weighs about 10 pounds. It's quite thick. They're about that thick with a curved arc, so it does all the work. The first troops that Camp ran were the 1st Illinois Infantry and the 1st Illinois Engineers. The infantry was in charge of Major Abel Davis. Remember that name. He'll be mentioned again. And then, not too long after that, the 86th Division was formed. And General Thomas E. Barry took command. On the 26th of September, 1917, the camp had a very special visitor. Former President Colonel Theodore Roosevelt got off the train and greeted a friend of his, Roger Fitch, current Lieutenant Colonel Roger Fitch, who had fought with Colonel Roosevelt in Cuba. He addressed 40,000 troops on the grounds of the A.C. Johnson farm by that big red barn, extolling the virtues of being in the military. He left, and then later on, before the 1st of the month, the 1st Illinois Engineers and the 1st Illinois Infantry left Camp Grant to go to Camp Logan, Texas, to become the 108th Engineers and the 131 Infantry, a part of the newly formed 33rd Infantry Division, National Army. They were gone from Camp Grant. As soon as the troops were trained, they were shipped out because the Army needed men to get ready to go to France. So they kept on losing personnel but gaining new ones. The French government and the British government sent over the officers to help train the troops because they knew what it was like to be in the trenches. And there were 2 lines of trenches created at Camp Grant so the men could get a small taste of what they were going to get into once they landed in France. That area doesn't exist anymore. But they had the black houses and living in the trenches in the winter, because it would be the same type of weather over in Europe, so they had to get trained properly. They were, excuse me, they were called the Allied Military Mission. They taught the men how to fight. One officer, his particular expertise was the bayonet. And there were bayonet training outfits. Big, heavy quilted canvas pad, a leather face mask with an iron bird cage here, and heavy mittens. And they didn't use a real bayoneted rifle. That's a chunk of wood cut out with a padded ball on the end for practicing. And that's why the chest pad and a face mask instead of it, just in case somebody got a little snarky. The trenches also had no man's land in between. It was barbed wire, the pigtail barbed wire stakes, everything to give them a full taste of what was to come. General Barry slipped away for a little while, and General Kennan was in charge. Nobody knew where General Barry had gone. All of a sudden, Thanksgiving of 1917, he was back. He had gone to France and gone to the front lines to see what was really going on, and he could bring word back for himself and his officers of what to expect. They never went with the division. Well, the division itself did not go into combat. The elements of the artillery and men who had trained were with different divisions, different battalions, and they were in France. A couple of them even ended up in Siberia. But that's another story for another time. General Barry and General Kennan were deemed too old to command troops in combat. They had all, both of them had numerous decorations. They were both West Point graduates, but they were shipped out to somewhere else. General Charles Martin took over the 86th Division. General Kennan passed away in September of 1918, just before the armistice. They were both cited for bravery in fighting the Indians, so they weren't slouches, but the government said, you're too old to fight. They had to go along with it. Officers and soldiers follow orders. There wasn't an artillery range at Camp Grant. So, in May of 1918, there was a road trip from Rockford on a straight line up to Camp Robinson in Wisconsin with the artillery range. Now you've got horse-drawn artillery, you've got wagons, cavalry, and engineers went along to clear campsites. They went through Leiden and Roscoe, Illinois, Beloit, Janesville, Evansville, Brooklyn, Madison, Token Creek, Poynette, Portage, Kilburn, Mauston, Hustler, and they reached Sparta on the 28th of May. All in preparations for going overseas were underway at Camp Grant. Still other units were requesting personnel. So 2,500 of those trained men were sent to Camp Custer, Michigan to become part of the 85th Division. They had Memorial Day festivities at Camp Grant. They had sporting events, wrestling, boxing, baseball, football. And in June, they were at a place right there at the south end of the airport, Camp Grant. It's called the Cavalry Bowl. Some of it still exists. It's a geological formation at the south end of the plateau where the airport is now, in a semicircle. Perfect sound conductor. I had the opportunity some years ago to give a lecture there, and I was on the floor of the bowl, and I was speaking just like this, and they heard me all the way at the top. Perfect natural formation. They set up rings there for boxing. They held church services there, cavalry exhibitions. In July of 1918, they had a big special event, the Sports Carnival. The heavyweight champion of the world at that time, Jess Willard, put on a boxing exhibition in the ring set up in the Cavalry Bowl. Secretary of War Newton Baker was there. He spoke down at the same location. And I spoke before about the James Farmhouse being converted into the press corps. They had no idea about a press corps early on. But a Chicago advertising man by the name of Spearman Lewis came up with the idea. Any non-military news that would be good to put in the newspaper, naturally filtered, censored. They set this building up as the press corps office, and an officer from each battalion was there. And there was a newspaper called the Trench and Camp newspaper. It was published by the local major newspapers. The Camp Grant edition was published by the Chicago Daily News, and they were out there taking photographs. And that ran from September of 1917 until October of 1919 as the Trench and Camp News. In October of 1919, like I said, the Trench and Camp no longer existed. It was called the Roll Call. Same kind of newspaper, but not as in-depth as the Trench and Camp. At the end of September 1918, September 23rd to be specific, tragedy hit Camp Grant. The Spanish influenza. From September the 23rd to October the 1st, 1,400 people died from the flu right there within the confines of Camp Grant. That was a city unto itself with 50,000 people. 1,400 of them were gone in a week.
Sure.
And the hospital and the morgue right there at Camp Grant.
Greg, just real quick, do you mind speaking up a bit? I know some of the folks in the back can't hear as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll get a little louder, sorry. 1,400 people died within a week at Camp Grant. The morgue and the hospital on site couldn't handle it. So all the morticians from the surrounding communities and Rockford came to Rockford to help. The soldiers and nurses who had passed away were taken to a building called the Lincoln Garage in Rockford. It was the only building large enough to handle the volume. That building is now gone. And they were interned in the Rockford cemeteries. There was a cemetery, a World War I cemetery on site near the hospital, but I haven't found it yet. I know it's part of it's still there, but one of these days I'll get down and dirty and find it. It's right along the river. The camp commander at that time was so distraught, all the death around it, he committed suicide. The end of the fighting in Europe brought an end to the training at Camp Grant, but the camp wasn't done. The base hospital had received a lot of wounded, and they had classes to help rehabilitate those wounded soldiers. It might seem simple, but basket weaving, hand-eye coordination, bring that back, typing, and the new medium of radio. That was the up-and-coming thing. And they had classes, they had mechanics classes, they had classes on the new methods for farming. Soldiers took that because they were going to return to their previous occupations very soon. And there was something new in the wind, so they took all the training classes they could. The Army still hadn't given up the camp yet. There were National Guard troops, not officially there, but stationed there in 1919 and 1920. And the Army, regular Army, even had a polo team there at Camp Grant. In December of 1923, the Army deeded the property to the Illinois National Guard. And they moved in January. General George Bell, who had commanded the 33rd Division in combat over in France, was the commanding general of the 33rd Division Illinois National Guard. The cavalry bowl at the south end of the airport was named for him. It's still called the Bell Bowl. The guardsmen took over the training. And then, as now, 2 weeks every summer, off to AT, annual training. Guardsmen from all over the state of Illinois came into Camp Grant and did the normal training. General Bell retired, and a former colonel with the 122nd Field Artillery, who was a big wig in Chicago, but he was also an excellent soldier. Now General Milton Foreman took over command. General Foreman, when he was a colonel in combat, artilleryman, he wasn't getting the proper information fast enough, so he went up to the front lines within machine gun range of the Germans and sent back all the information. He performed as a forward observer himself, and he was given the third highest military decoration for his bravery under fire in combat. So he was no slouch either. And he's also got a connection to the American Legion. I'll get into that pretty soon. But also, one of the officers under General Foreman's command was now General Abel Davis. He also has an American Legion connection to get into. The troops trained every weekend. The middle weekend was family weekend, and there was also Governor's Day. The governor of the state of Illinois would take the trek up from Springfield, stay in the commanding officer's quarters, the former McClarty farmhouse, and review the troops. And during those middle weekends, a personal friend of General Foreman's used to, 3 times came up to Camp Grant to visit him, John J. Pershing, to review the troops. And General Pershing, before he retired, the last troops he reviewed were the 33rd Infantry Division troops under his friend, General Milton Foreman. Another soon-to-be very famous officer, he was only a colonel then, was helping train the troops of the 106th Cavalry, then Colonel John Marshall. General Marshall, the Marshall Plan, that Marshall. He loved riding. He was an equestrian champion. In 1940 was the last time troops of the Guard were at Camp Grant. It was deeded over back to the U.S. Army. In February 1941, after they had done all the reconstruction of the new barracks, some of us are familiar with those World War II type barracks, first floor and second floor. I see some heads shaking, not comfortable. No, they're not. But there were quite a few there. There was few hundred barracks. One portion of Camp Grant, the Camp Grant grounds. Yeah. This section here, in this photograph, is the Recruit Reception Center. Everybody that got off the train went there first to take tests to see which branch of the Army they were going to be sent to. And this large portion is the Medical Replacement Training Center. All the troops, when he was called out Doc, that's where he was trained. They had dental tech, and they had the last remaining veterinary school, because when Camp Grant reopened in 1941, we still had horse cavalry. A lot of personalities came through there too. There was one gentleman who had previously served in the French Foreign Legion and fought in North Africa, and gave a dire warning because some of the rumblings, the rumors, the bamboo telegraph was that we were going to invade North Africa. And he said, keep the last bullet for yourself. He had a up close and personal experience in that part of the world. Brigadier John Willis was in command of Camp Grant during World War II. And he had his headquarters. He could have stayed in the McClarty farmhouse, commanding officer's quarters, which was still there, but he had a room at the Faust Hotel in downtown Rockford.
Excuse me, Greg, could you
It's still with us.
speak up a little bit? Thank you. Excellent.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to bellow.
Oh, that's okay. We just
Okay.
had some people in the back who were saying they weren't able to hear.
The Faust Hotel still stands, but it is a retirement community now. The Big Orange Monster, as it was called, the water towers. There were 2 of them at Camp Grant that supplied the water. The third picture down, that's, even though it's a World War I snapshot, the first is the wooden water tower that was the very first, and the second one, this picture was taken in 1917, was built by the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company. One of those water towers still exists. But there were 2, and they called it the Orange Monster because of the paint job. One, I don't know which one is the one left, but one stood is an original campground water tower. A lot of performers, Hollywood personalities, radio personalities, came to the service club there at Camp Grant. Burns and Allen show was filmed there. Anybody familiar with Say Goodnight, Gracie? Bob Hope may have, haven't found a reference yet. But learning about Camp Grant has been a daily process for the past 21 years. I figure out and find something old new almost every day. The 6th of February, 1941, Field Marshal Irwin Rommel was given command of the Africa Corps. Early in 1943, both the Africa Corps and the Allied forces, or the Italian forces, surrendered to the Allies. After going through questioning at various locations, a place that's on the north side of Kensington Palace, it was called the London Cage. They questioned the German soldiers to see if they were just have to join the German army or they were totally dedicated to their Fuhrer. In August of '43, Camp Grant got a new contingent of soldiers, the first German POWs, who were all Africa Corps. I know where the POW camp is. It's been disturbed. It's a factory-built area now. It wasn't too far from the intersection of Falcon and Samuelson, on where Highway 251 is now. They saw traffic going back and forth on the road. There were 2,500 German POWs housed at Camp Grant. And they had a whole new experience coming to them. They were treated decently, except the fact that they were prisoners behind barbed wire. And the government figured out quite quickly that they needed workers because all the men were overseas, the women were in the factories. But who was picking the crops? Who was canning all the vegetables and fruits? They got permission, the federal government, to hire German POWs who wanted to work. They could not do war work. That was, Geneva Convention said no to that one. So they were worked in the farm fields, they worked in the canning factories, they worked in the laundry there at Camp Grant, or other non-war work jobs. There were 3 summer locations in Hampshire, in Sycamore, and a little further out west in a town called Lanark. There were camps set up just for the growing season, from planting to harvesting. POWs who wanted to work got sent there. And in Hampshire, they were even more thrilled that they had this chance, because they also had the chance to practice their religion, which they were not allowed to do. On Sundays, during the time they were at that section camp, they would put on their best clothes and march down the street. Now in July, singing Christmas carols. But these men were very happy. They would march down the main street there in Hampshire, and one group would go to the Catholic Church, and the other group would go to the Protestant Church right there in town. But back at the confines of Camp Grant, the ones that slipped through the cracks of the London Cage and still were very much on the side of their leader held trials. And those that didn't want to go along with their program, they locked them in one of the barracks and set them on fire. And now, some of them were injured, but none of them died. But the others were dealt with by the U.S. Army. The POWs also had a chance to create art. They were very handy, they were artisans. And the National War Work Council, the German Red Cross, the National Catholic Welfare League, the YMCA, got them art materials, paintbrushes, whatever. And what they created out of nothing, fabulous work. These are pictures. This is the Hampshire camp up here, and that is a blow-up. Like I said before, the men were paid for their work. They were paid 80 cents a day, not cash, but a little book of payment chips. They're only like ½ an inch by 1 inch, and they couldn't be taken out of the book by anyone but the clerk at the exchange. And they were very happy. They didn't know that they could buy radios. They could buy toothpaste, toothbrushes, whatever they needed. And they worked for it. They were thrilled. And with those materials, they had art shows. And there was a great liking for all their German badges. Being an ingenious soldier, they took the toothpaste tubes of the time, melted them down, and made copies of their German insignias and sold them at the art shows. And they also did fabulous artwork. Does anybody remember what a linoprint is? The old style linoleum. You cut a picture in it, but you cut it backwards. And then you put paper, ink on it, and paper, and you've got a print. Linoprints. Actual paintings from memory of where they were in North Africa or at home. They did all this. Just beautiful artwork. I saw a baby's cradle. That it was just a rocking cradle. But the German POW painted a rabbit on either side. And I saw this thing and it looked like the rebel was going to hop right off. That's how beautiful and accurate the artwork was that these people did. They were issued old American uniforms. Some tunics like this with the pockets taken off and PW stenciled, or the denim fatigues, which were not in use by the U.S. Army anymore. Again, with PW, P on the back, PW, etc. But when they were off duty, they put their German uniforms back on. And the officers, being the old Germanic style officers, would walk in conference with one another around the perimeter of the camp, and the NCOs would take charge of the enlisted personnel. And they were treated at the base hospital. Pretty soon, the training for the medics started to wind down. The recruit reception center was changed to train the general hospitals, not the TV show, the tents that served battle casualties over in France and Belgium and Germany. And then they closed that down. The only portions open were part of the hospital area for the POWs, because as the war wound down, the POWs were the only troops left there. And in May of 1946, that even ended, because they were all sent back to Europe. Some of them wanted to stay. In fact, a couple of them wanted to stay so bad they left Camp Grant, just without permission. One worked in the laundry And you know yourself, before you throw clothes in the washer, you make sure all the pockets are empty. Remember, they weren't allowed to have cash. So this guy would go through the pockets of the pants and find change. And he had enough change to buy himself a train ticket to Chicago. He blended in with the German community around St. Alphonsus Church at Ashland and Wellington, Ashland, south of Belmont Avenue. That was all German at the time. He passed himself off as a Dutch refugee. Okay. He got a job at the circulation department of the Chicago Tribune. And then he got himself a job at a bookstore that used to be on Wabash Avenue. Everybody remember Crocs and Brentanos? Yeah. This German POW was working at Crocs and Brentanos. And then he decided that he wanted to open up his own business, which he did on North Wells Street. People came in and out every day. He was still this Dutch refugee. He almost had a heart attack one day, though. One of the camp guards from Camp Grant walked in the door that he recognized, who didn't recognize him. Anyway. But then some of Mr. Hoover's men came knocking at the door. They had been observing him for quite a few months, and they told him flat out, you have to go back. You can't stay. But we were observing you for all this time, and you've done nothing but run a business. You have a wife and a daughter. You can come back, but the right way. So he did. And he opened up a small bookstore in Hamburg, but then came back over here, cleaned up his affairs, and took his family back to Germany with him. Another gentleman was a farmer. All he wanted to do was work on a farm. He didn't want to fight anybody, he didn't want to shoot anybody, he was just a farmer. So he decided one day he was going to leave too. And somehow got up to Cedarburg, Wisconsin, north of Milwaukee. Was working on a farm. Happy as this is what he wanted to do until the FBI came calling and you had to go back. So he had ended up back in Germany too. 1947 came around and the buildings were being auctioned off. Camp Grant had been deeded by President Truman to the Rockford Airport Authority. And all the buildings were torn down. You could buy one of those barracks buildings for $100. Just had to take it apart yourself and take it home. And there is a home in Rockford, that the first home of a gentleman and his wife who I interviewed. They took the building apart themselves. They didn't have any help. But they built, he was a contractor. He built their first home with the material from the barracks where he was stationed. He specifically bought the one that he was in. Their first home was built with the materials from that place, and the home still stands. And the windows are definitely, you look at them and, oh, those are Army barracks windows. And Camp Grant is now the Rockford Regional Airport, south of Rockford, Illinois, right along the Rock River. There's only a couple of buildings left that were there then. There's one building that has a portion of it that was around in World War I. That's right where the train station used to be at Falcon and Samuelson. And the other building, there were 4 chapels at Camp Grant. St. Paul's, which was over by the river, by the officers' quarters. The Emmanuel Chapel, St. Mary's, and All Saints Chapel. St. Mary's and All Saints were in the Recruit Reception Center. And the only one left of all 4, it's converted into a private home, but it looks like an Army chapel because that's what it was. It was All Saints Chapel, the only one remaining on its original site. And it had been dedicated in September of 1941. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Camp Grant. Are there any questions?
we're gonna talk about the connection with the American Legion with
General Foreman. He was a friend of General Pershing's. No slouch in combat. In March of 1919, he was still in Europe. They were in Paris, March the 15th, the birthday of the American Legion. There was a caucus at Cirque de Paris in France, the first American Legion conference, caucus. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. was there, several other officers, and General Foreman was one of the speakers. He came back and became the commanding general of the Guard, 33rd Division. Then in May of 1919, in St. Louis, Missouri, there was the St. Louis Caucus, where the preamble for the American Legion was written, and one of the movers and shakers behind that was General Abel Davis, along with another man who had served with General Foreman in combat, but he had a very distinguished Chicago-related name, Marshall Field III. He was one of the prime movers with his name and influence in the establishment of the Department of Illinois of the American Legion. In fact, he even let the home post, Marshall Field Post number 11, meet originally in the Walnut Room at Marshall Field's. Now, you had questions?
Yes, sir. You had mentioned the artillery from Camp Grant not having an artillery range, and
Right.
that they moved on up to Wisconsin and ended up in Sparta, Wisconsin. Okay.
Camp Robinson.
Well, I'm familiar with that area because I would TDY from Fort Riley to Camp McCoy, in Sparta is just outside of Camp McCoy. Was that ever part? Well, at that time, but it's Fort McCoy now.
McCoy swallowed up Camp Robinson because I was up at that artillery range too, with tank firing range, and yeah, that was the range that the artillery from Camp Grant would have gone to fire. Yes, ma'am.
In World War II, was Camp Grant just for the inductees from Northern Illinois?
They were from all over the country. There were people there from World War II now. Could have come from anywhere. Because again, the Medical Replacement Training Center was there. So you've got your dental techs, you've got your field medics, they all took their training there. Could have been from New York, Florida, Mississippi, anywhere in the United States, because they were, at the time, they were the only ones training medics and medical personnel.
But those who were forming the 33rd from the state of Illinois, were there other camps in the state, or was everybody sent up
In
here?
World War I. There was, Fort Sheridan was established earlier. That was over, still is, along the lakefront. But as far as Northern Illinois, Camp Grant was it at that time for World War I. Oh, I misspoke. Camp Logan, Illinois, which that park north of Zion, Illinois Beach State Park. If you go to the far northern end of it, there's still an itty-bitty remnant of the World War I Camp Logan. You gotta hunt to find it, but it's there. Yes, sir.
I've heard the story that Pesci's Nursery had prisoners of war working there. And where did they reside when they were here?
Oh, here, they would have been, from here, it's not that far back to Rockford, so they would have been trucked back and
Every
forth.
day?
Every day.
I think
there's
there's
one
one
in
in World War
Oh, I think
II.
they lived here.
Camp Pine.
Camp Hunt.
There we go.
River.
I remember I said that it's a daily learning process. Now, thank you so much. I gotta dig up stuff I can't find. Was that the one that is what's now LaBelle Woods, right off of 41? At
It's
Foster Avenue?
near Lake, on River Road, eastern River Road, right on the river.
It's just north of here. It's just north of here.
And the Pesci
It's
guys
not
had a
Camp Pine
reunion
Woods Forest
there
Preserve.
years ago.
As my wife will tell you, I'm relentless with research.
Because
And it's
Africa-
always expensive. Write that name down, I won't forget it, but write it down anyway.
When we grew up as Girl Scouts, we were able to camp at Camp Pine in the old barracks.
Oh, wow.
Oh, jeez. I'll wait till fall.
And we were there in winter.
After the first frost, stuff will be easier to find.
Where were they exactly, the barracks?
Well, it's not there anymore. They're all been torn down, but not far from dam number two.
Over there.
But
But we pass by that all the time, right off Route 45.
You enter off Euclid, just east of River.
Got it.
Okay.
There's a sign there.
I got it.
Okay.
It'll float back into the computer. See, I told you it's a learning process, right? Yes, sir.
The History Center has extensive files on Camp Pine here in their records, so they
Okay.
can help you. The other question.
Emma, you're gonna gain a visitor,
All right.
or I'll bring my cot.
How did, I assume that when Camp Grant was finally named, that it was named after Ulysses?
Yes, it was Cantonment Rockford.
Right.
Up until just before General Roosevelt arrived on the 26th of September of 17. They picked the name of the most prominent Illinoisan in the general area. And it was General/President Ulysses S. Grant. Yes, sir.
I grew up, I was born and raised in Rockford, so I heard about Camp Grant a lot from my dad. I'm not sure he enlisted in the Army, I'm not sure when, 41, 2, 3, 42 or 3. I'm not sure if he processed through Camp Grant, but I was just bring two questions. You mentioned the chapels for the people in the Sunday
Yes, sir.
worship. Did they make any provision for Jewish men?
Yes, yes. All 4 chapels had the availability for Catholic, Protestant, Jewish services, but the Emmanuel Chapel was set up specifically for Jewish services, but say All Saints.
Okay.
There was All Saints, it was Catholic or Protestant, depending on, but there was a traveling ark that the rabbi from Rockford would bring along and have the Jewish services at any of the 4.
Okay, second question.
Yes, sir.
My dad was quite a kidder, and he used to kid my mother that the guys at Camp Grant and during the Depression used to eat cat burgers. Can you comment if that's actually a true story?
No. Now.
No,
Yes, sir.
seriously, you think it was a myth?
Well, some of the food, the way it was prepared, it might have seemed like it, but no. No, that's just somebody's very funny story.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Rotten sense of humor, I like it.
you had mentioned early on that the 33rd Division was part of the National Army.
Right.
Okay.
Well, when they were formed, their birthplace, unlike the 86th, who was born at Camp Grant, their birthplace was Camp Logan, which is now a city park in Houston, Texas.
Well, when did it morph into the National Guard?
After World War I.
Okay.
After demobilization. They were mostly Illinois men, some from other areas, but mostly Illinois. So the 129th, the 130th, the 132nd, the 131, the 129, the 122nd Field Artillery, the 202nd Coast Artillery, the Searchlights, everybody was right there at Camp Grant. Yes, sir.
I assume, given the favorable conditions at the camp for the German POWs, that there were few attempts to escape.
There were 2, those 2 men.
Just those two?
Only those 2.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I think the 106th Cavalry
Troop
became
106
the 106th Tank Battalion and 44th Recon of the 44th National, Illinois 44th National Guard out of Sycamore.
Originally, Troop E of the 106 Cavalry was down at the Chicago Avenue Armory, Chicago and Michigan Avenue. I know, because when I got back from Vietnam, I had a Navy commitment to finish off, and then I switched over to the Army Guard. My first unit was right there, Troop B, 106 Cavalry, Recon Scout. That was me. I had more fun than I was in the Navy. Yes, sir.
You mentioned 32nd Engineers. Do you know of any correlation between the 32nd Engineers and the 32nd Signal Construction Company out of Chicago?
No, the 32nd Engineers was just a engineer specific. Now the 108th Engineers, again 108th support. They're at the Armory over there at North and Kedzie. They're one of the few remaining units in the Illinois National Guard that can trace their lineage back to October of 1917.
Now, all of downstate is 44th National Guard. Everything out of this northern area is 44th National Guard.
That's the modern makeup of the National Guard. I'd have to study that too, but I don't go any further back further forward than 1947. Yes?
Do you want to talk about the two other uniforms?
Research sometimes is expensive, but it's always fun. I got this overcoat, and inside, in the back, is written Headquarters Company, 333rd Field Artillery. So I got my book out, and I found the headquarters going through. Unfortunately, it's not named. I can't tell you who it is. But that's how I discovered the name of that. Mr. Heidecke, who was from here in Des Plaines, is trying to look up the men from the 333rd Field Artillery. And another uniform that I got, I was looking it up, and found my grandmother's brother, my great uncle. And he's in that picture somewhere from Company L, 344th Infantry. So I'm going to have fun with the magnifying glass. Yes, sir. Or ma'am, excuse me.
I know when the troops were coming back after World War II, there was desperate need for housing. And I understand housing was built on Camp Grant. Can you tell me when that started?
Okay, there is an area, you can still see some of it if you're going westbound on Harrison, and you just come over a little rise, somewhere about 18th Street, you look to your 10 or 11 o'clock. There are some buildings that look like, yeah, those are Army barracks for certain. That's called Nokomo Heights, NCO, housing. Also, and the buildings that used to be, up until 2005, over in the Recruit Reception Center side, there were 6 regular sized buildings. They looked like they were Army buildings at one time, which they were. The 2 on the east and the 2 on the west were mess halls for Camp Grant, World War II. And they had the distinction of being the first place in the every camp in the United States of having the stainless steel mess trays. They had crockery before that, and you know how expensive that can be if it falls on the floor.
And you didn't have any menus, right? So you couldn't tell
No,
it was camper.
what you see is what you get. Pass it on, move down. And in the 2 middle buildings, one was a mini exchange, and one was a small supply room where the recruits would be issued their uniforms, right there in the Recruit Reception Center. Those buildings lasted from 1941 until 2005. They had been turned into lower income housing, and they finally fell apart, and now it's a vacant lot.